Hùng King. Hùng King c. 2524 BC. Ch letter 1 ef Hun, Chinese letter, Chinese letter or Vier Hung letter 24930, Vuong means king and Vua means monarch. Etymology. It is likely that the name Hung Vuong is a combination of the two Sino-Vietnamese words Hung Chinese letter masculine, virile, fierce, powerful, grand and Vuong Chinese letter, which means king. The name Hung Vuong might have originally been a title bestowed on a chieftain. The Hung Vuong was allegedly the head chieftain of Van Lang, which at the time was composed of feudal communities of rice farmers. Hung King's narrative. According to the Hung King's narrative, the 18 Hung Kings belonged to the Hồng Bàng dynasty c. 2879–258 BCE that ruled over the northern part of modern Vietnam in antiquity. Their progenitors were Dragon Lord Al-1E1C and his consort Fairy Ako, who produced a sac containing 100 eggs from which 100 sons emerged. Dragon Lord Al-1E1C preferred to live by the sea, and Fairy Ako preferred the snow-capped mountains. The two separated with half of the sons following each parent. The most illustrious of the sons became the first Hung King who ruled Van Lang, the realm of all the descendants of Dragon and Fairy Ako, who became the Vietnamese people, from his capital in modern Th letter 1 UCD province. Earliest references. The earliest references to the Hung Kings are found in early collections of records of Nanu or Nanueji Chinese letter in the 978 anthology extensive records of the Taiping era. It said, Chaoji's land was very fertile. After people settled there, they began to cultivate. Its soils are black, its climate gloomy, and first Chinese letter SV th letter 1e3m Han. So hitherto its fields were called Hung Fields Chinese letter SV Hung D Strokai letter 1ec1n, and its people were Hung People Chinese letter SV Hung Dan. Their leader was Hung King Chinese letter SV Hung Vuong, and his chief advisors were Hung Lords Chinese letter SV Hung H letter 1e7u. The lands distributed to Hung Generals Chinese letter SV Hung T letter 1b0 letter 1e dbng. However, the 4th century almanacs of the outer territories of the Dao province Chinese letter mentioned a letter 1e1c fields, a letter 1e1c people, a letter 1e1c generals, and a letter 1e1c lords, ruled by a letter 1e1c king instead. During the time before Jiaoji had commanderies and prefectures, the soil and land had a letter 1e1c fields Chinese letter SV, a letter 1e1c d stroke I letter 1ec1n. These fields followed the flood's ebbs and flows. The people cultivated these fields for foods, so they were called a letter 1e1c people Chinese letter SV, a letter 1e1c Dan. The a letter 1e1c king Chinese letter SV, a letter 1e1c Vuong, and a letter 1e1c lords Chinese letter SV, a letter 1e1c H letter 1e7u established to govern all those commanderies and prefectures. Prefectures many made a letter 1e1c generals Chinese letter SV, a letter 1e1c T, letter 1bz, or a letter 1e dbng. A letter 1e1c generals copper seals and blue-green ribbons. Therefore, French scholar Henry Masbeu and Vietnamese scholar Nguy letter 1ec5 and Van T letter 1ed1 proposed that Chinese letter SV Han was actually a scribble error for Chinese letter SV, a letter 1e1c. The Hung Kings' 18 generations or dynasties were mentioned in D-stroke letter 1e1i letter 1ec7ts letter 1ed letter 1b0 letter 1e3c Chinese letter Great Vates, a British history by an anonymous 14th century author. In King Chuanavu's time, in Jinan division Chinese letter, there was a strange man could use mystical arts, overwhelm all the tribes. He styled self D-stroke letter 1ed1i King Chinese letter SV. D-stroke letter 1ed1i Vuong, capital was in Van Lang, appellation was Van Lang State Chinese letter. Their customs were substantively honest, strings and knots for their regulations. Passing down 18 generations, all styled D-stroke letter 1ed1i kings. Chinese historian Liu Zhanglan, Apud Live, 2013, considered Chinese letter SV. D-stroke letter 1ed1i Vuong let Pestle King to be Chinese letter SV, a letter 1e1c Vuong erroneously transmitted. Another early known reference is purportedly found in a story called Tale of the Mountain Spirit and Water Spirit in the 1329 VI letter 1 EC7 TD stroke I letter 1 EC7 NU Lin T letter 1 ADP collection of legends and biographies of heroes and founding spirits compiled by Lai T letter 1 EBFSIN, where the Hung King was the Mei ruler. The next earliest appearance is in the 14th-15th century Lin Namshich choir read Tales of Selected Oddities from South of the Passes, a collection of myths and legends compiled by various authors. Early 20th century textual references. Textual references in the early 20th century highlight that the Hung Kings were already a key part of the Vietnamese collective memory. The 1916 TR letter 1 EA7 and TR letter 1 ECDNG Kim's elementary textbook for a brief history of Annam, the first vernacular history of Vietnam in the Vietnamese alphabet, covered the period from the Hung Kings to colonial times. TR letter 1 EA7 and TR letter 1 ECDNG Kim was an official in the education service who later became Prime Minister of the 1945 Japanese-sponsored B letter 1 EA30D stroke letter 1 EA1I government. In the book, TR letter 1 EA7 and TR letter 1 ECDNG Kim uses the expression that has become one of the most popular labels for the VI letter 1 EC70, connecting them to the Hung King's race of the Dragon and the Fae, and in his revised 1920 edition, Children of the Fae, Grandchildren of the Dragon, or the Descendants of the Fae and the Dragon. TR letter 1 EA7 and TR letter 1 ECDNG Kim's text became a standard textbook until 1954 in all parts of Vietnam. Van B letter 1 ED9 Ai Chow, an early Vietnamese nationalist, wrote a poem in 1910 which glorifies the lineage of children of the dragon, grandchildren of the fairy. H letter 1 ED3 Chai Min's biography, published in South Vietnam in 1948, mentions Ho recalling the day of the proclamation of independence of Vietnam on September 2, 1945, and describing it as a day to remember for 25 million people, the children of the L letter 1 E1C and the grandchildren of H letter 1 ED3NG. Developments in the 15th century. Historians studying the Hung Kings have suggested that developments from the 13th to the 15th centuries explain why there was a desire by D stroke letter 1 E1 IVI letter 1 EC7T to incorporate the founding epic of the Hung Kings into its history. As different groups of local elites in Jiaoxi in the 1000s and worked at the transition to an independent D stroke letter 1 EA1 IVI letter 1 EC7T, the question of political legitimization was an urgent one that needed tackling, especially given the lack of ancient Viet sources to base on, and after about 1,000 years of Chinese rule. This explained why it attempted to reach back in time and create a mythic past for itself to serve its present political needs. Although part of the legitimization process included eliminating colonial Chinese influences, ironically, it was the ease with Chinese characters and sources that caused them to utilize Chinese history and sources to validate their own. Academics have argued that the historicization and utilization of the Hung Kings epic can be explained by developments from the 13th century. 3 devastating invasions by the Mongols in the 13th century, the Cham in the 14th century, and the Ming in the 15th century corresponded with the myth's emergence and absorption into historiography. By late 1330, with social problems growing in the countryside, the TR letter 1 EA7N ruler Mintong started to move away from THI letter 1 EC1 ends in Buddhism, which did not seem to be working in its integrative function, and looked to Confucianism and antiquity. He brought the Confucian teacher Chu Vanan into the capital, and the latter's emphasis on the classical beliefs of China and its antiquity set the intellectual tone of Thanglong. Antiquity was now seen as providing solutions for the difficult present. The disastrous invasion by the Cham under CH letter 1 EBFB letter 1 ED3 and G and God destroyed the TR letter 1 EA7N dynasty and caused Vietnamese literati to seek desperately for means to restore harmony. The Ming occupation of 1407–1427 dramatically deepened the influence of the literati through promoting schools and scholarship. Developments from the 13th century then combined to set the stage for the state promotion of the Hung King founding myth by the 15th century. There was a shift away from a more indigenous, pre-Southeast Asian phase to the Neo-Confucian revolution of Lê Tôn Thon. This, together with the chaos created by the devastating invasions and internal social problems, encouraged a search for Vietnamese antiquity modelled on classical Chinese antiquity in the mythic creation of Van Lan via the Hung King. Canonization in Goes Sai Lanes D stroke letter 1 1 IVI letter 1 EC70 S letter 1 EDK turn the complete book of the historical records of D stroke letter 1 1 IVI letter 1 EC70. Canonization in Goes Sai Lanes D stroke letter 1 1 IVI letter 1 EC70 S letter 1 EDK turn the complete book of the historical records of D stroke letter 1 1 IVI letter 1 EC70. The canonization of the Hung King's founding myth was carried out by Ngo Sai Lain in his compiling of a new history of the realm under the order of Emperor Lethonton 1460-97, drawing upon popular sources. This history, the D-stroke letter 1 1 IVI letter 1 EC70 S letter 1 EDK Tansu complete book of the historical records of D-stroke letter 1 1 IVI letter 1 EC70 was used by the emperor as a tool to promote VI letter 1 EC70 national feeling. Thus, Ngo Sai Lain was tasked to promote D-stroke letter 1 1 IVI letter 1 EC70 S supernatural and millennial ancestry. This marked the first time a VI letter 1 EC70 state traced its origins back to the first realm of An Lan of the Hung Kings, calculated by Ngo Sai Lain to be in 2879 BCE. Prior to this, official dynastic histories of the VI letter 1 EC70 started with TRI letter 1 EC7 Yuda acknowledging a king general as the founder of the Nam VI letter 1 EC70. This was done based mostly on Dosu chronicles and in particular their raid tales. Court historians in the later dynasties followed Ngo Sai Lain's example in integrating the Hung Kings into VI letter 1 EC70 official historiography. Dissemination of Hung King's epic from the 15th century. There was likely already a long oral tradition in the Red River Delta of the reenactment of myths and legends at the level of the village even before myths were written into literature. Each village held yearly festivities at the communal temple with public recitations and reenactments DA letter 1 EC5NX letter 1B0 letter 1 EDBNG, during which villagers recreated the specific myth, historical event, or character. Thus, Hung King's worship may have existed locally before the 15th century, manifesting in the construction of temples and shrines, and in oral propagation of different variations of the Hung King's epic. Emperor Lethonton authorized in 1470 the Hun View and NG letter 1 ECDCPH letter 1 EA3TH letter 1 EADB bot TRUY letter 1 EC1 M precious genealogy of the 18 reigns of the Hun Kings. The text was reproduced in the successive dynasties, and court-issued copies were worshipped in village temples. Spirit promulgation was promoted by imperial decrees and intensified as the dynasties passed. In the 16th and 17th century, court academicians compiled, recopied, and modified collections of myths and genealogies about supernatural beings and national heroes, including that of the Hun Kings. This were then accepted and perpetuated by villages. The Hun Kings were transformed into Than Han tutelary spirits sanctified by imperial orders and by popular feeling stemming from long traditions of ancestor worship. Over time, the worship of Hung Kings evolved. They acquired sons-in-laws who became mountain spirits when migrating south for the territorial expansion and transformed themselves into whale spirits when near the sea. Land was also provided to temples in Phu Th letter 1 ECD province, the site of the main Hung temple, to meet the expense of Hung Kings worship. As late as 1945, the NGUY letter 1 EC5 N court continued to delegate officials to oversee rituals in the Hung King's temples of Phu Th letter 1 ECD. NGUY letter 1 EC5 NTH letter 1 ECBD letter 1 EC7 U argues that as the result of the meeting of the two currents, that of the state's mythographic construction and that of popular, village-based animistic worship, the Hung Kings came to be venerated as the ancestral founders of the VI letter 1 EC17 nation in temples throughout the Red River Delta and beyond. The dissemination of the Hung Kings myth was also facilitated by the use of the L letter 1 E5C bot 68 verse form tales recounted using this form, aided with the use of QU letter 1 ED1C national sound instead of literary Chinese, and the use of colourful verse close to the vernacular allowed for the ease of memorization and transmission of such myths. Hung Kings in South Vietnam / Republic of Vietnam RVN. Hung Kings in South Vietnam / Republic of Vietnam RVN. The Hung Kings seem to have been well embedded in Vietnamese collective memory by the 1950s in the RVN. Olga Drawer has written about how the perception of the Hung Kings as common ancestors of all Vietnamese was mobilized for various agendas despite admitting a lack of historical evidence about them. Just like in the DRV and SRV, the RVN also commemorated the Hung Kings in a national holiday. The Hung Kings Memorial Day was one of the 20 official holidays at the inception of the RVN, but was dropped in January 1956 from the official list as Ngotin Di Letter 1EC7M as Prime Minister decided that citizens would not have time off for the holiday. The Hung Kings was hence rejected at the official level. However, at the public level, commemorations were allowed. The Saigon News Review and the Vietnam News Agency reported on celebrations around the state with the participation of many officials. With the assassination of Ngotin Di Letter 1EC7M and changes in the RVN government, the Hung Kings Memorial Day was restored to the list of official holidays in February 1964, allocating a whole day off for government employees and students. The Hung Kings Memorial Day became one of the 7 official holidays in the RVN with a full day of rest. In an April 1964 decree, the Hung Kings Memorial Day also became one of the 4 holidays requiring private businesses to give their employees paid time off. This elevated the status of the Hung Kings and highlighted their importance for official discourse. Perhaps the most important indication of the Hung Kings Memorial Day's significance is that it was a contender for the honour of being designated as National Day. In 1967, the National Assembly considered whether the Hung Kings Memorial Day should also be made Independence Day. While the initiative failed, the idea was surfaced again in the Senate in 1971 and discussed in the Cabinet in 1973. Hung Kings in North Vietnam/Democratic Republic of Vietnam DRV National History. Hung Kings in North Vietnam/Democratic Republic of Vietnam DRV National History. The conversion of the Hung Kings to historical truth in the DRV emerged over time through extensive discussions by DRV official scholars and resolutions by the party such as regarding the establishment of the date of the death anniversary of the Hung Kings and its celebration and festivals. The Institute of Archaeology was established in 1968 with the highest priority given to scientifically documenting the Hung Kings. The Institute launched excavations and organised conferences between 1968 and 1971 to discuss the findings and publish their proceedings. Historian Patricia Pelly posits that the selection of the Hung Kings and the Han Dynasty during the Van Lan period was part of Hanoi's quest to create a cult of antiquity to illustrate the historical longevity and prestige of Vietnam that predated the Chinese occupation. The transformation of the Hung Kings into a historical fact was based on the conflation of different kinds of evidence such as archaeological remains, dynastic chronicles, collections of legends, and a poem attributed to H.Lat.1ED3 Chim entitled The History of Vietnam from 2879 BC to 1945. DRV scholar and the first president of the Institute of History, Teo Letter 1E7N Hai Li Letter 1EC7U, settled the question of the origins of the Vietnamese nation in an article on the Hung Kings. The article noted that on the 10th day of the 3rd lunar month, the central government and local government held an official ceremony to commemorate the death anniversary of our Hung King ancestors at the Temple of the Hung Kings. He commented that the Hung Kings were the origins of the nation as they built the country, and if there had been no Hung Kings, then there would be no Din, Lai, Tio Letter 1E7N, H Letter 1ED3, or NGUY Letter 1EC5N, and also no Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Tio Letter 1E7N Hai Li Letter 1EC7U also wrote that the patriotic spirit and indomitable tradition of our nation broke out in 1,000 years of Chinese feudal rule, and it broke out in 100 years under the domination of the French colonizers. He concluded by lamenting that at this time our lovely country has been provisionally divided into 2 regions and our fellow countrymen in the south moan and ride under the fascist regime of the Gain of Ngotin Di Letter 1EC7AM, lackey of the American imperialists. Historian Sherry Haydon notes that this article is important for a few reasons. First, it highlights the direct link made between the period of the Hung Kings and the formation of the Vietnamese nation. Second, it dates the origins of Vietnamese resistance to foreign aggression to the founding of the nation. Third, it states explicitly the continuity between the period of the Hung Kings and the present. The dating of the origins of the nation to the rule of the Hung Kings would eventually become the orthodox position of historians at the Research Committee, the Institute of History, and later the Institute of Archaeology. Hung Kings and the Bronze Age. Bronze Age relics have been used to support the existence of the Kingdom of Van Lang and the Hung Kings. The official DRV National History, a letter 1 CBCHS letter 1 DVI letter 1 C17 published in 1971, asserted the connection between the Bronze Age and the Donson culture and the period of the Hung Kings. However, Hayden Shea has argued that contrary to the assertions of Vietnamese scholars, such relics cannot provide such a support. He notes that the earliest Vietnamese text to describe this kingdom, the D-stroke letter 1E1 IVI letter 1EC7TS letter 1EDL letter 1B0 letter 1E3C, dates from the 13th century, 1800 years after the kingdom it is supposed to describe. The earliest Chinese text, which mentions not the Hung but the Lat kings, dates from the 4th century CE, 800 years after the period it discusses. Hence, such texts are not reliable transmissions of any written or oral tradition over 8 or 1800 years. Hung Kings as invented tradition. Analyses of the earliest sources and the Hung Kings have illustrated problems with these sources that have been used as historical evidence of the existence of the Hung Kings. In particular, historians have examined the Linam Chich Kwai Ally letter 1 EC7 TTRUY letter 1 EC7 narrate tales of selected oddities from south of the passes compiled by Tiot letter 1 EA7 Nin TH letter 1 EBF up under the late 14th century Tiot letter 1 EA7 Nin dynasty and amended in the 15th century under the Led dynasty by Vu QU letter 1 EF3 NH and KI letter 1 EC1 UFU. This source is of great importance in providing core information for Ngosilian's D-stroke letter 1E1 IVI letter 1 EC7TS letter 1 ED Kaitan, the complete book of the historical records of D-stroke letter 1E1 IVI letter 1 EC7T created in 1479, which marked the official transformation of the Han Kings into the founders of dynasties. The D-stroke letter 1E1 IVI letter 1 EC7TS letter 1 ED Kaita and the was in turn the core text that DRV historians used as proof of the ancient origins of the Vietnamese people and the Vietnamese nation. Based on an analysis of an essay called Biography of the H letter 1 ED3NG Bang clan from their raid tales, historian Liam Kelly posits that the Hung Kings did not exist. Instead, he argues that they were invented in the medieval period when the Sinicized elite in the Red River Delta first constructed a separate identity in relation to China's cultural heritage. Kelly exposes the problems of the biography in a few ways, for example, by showing how it borrowed figures and accounts from ancient Chinese texts and stories, and by highlighting issues with terms such as Hung, a letter 1E1C, and VI letter 1EC7T. He does this by examining ancient Chinese historical sources to highlight similar terms and stories as in biography, and search for terms and accounts mentioned in biography to corroborate the existence of the latter's information on the Hung Kings. In doing so, he also shows how this practice of drawing upon old texts for material to create a local history was also practiced at the time in parts of the Chinese Empire like Sichuan and Guangdong, hence placing the biography in the broader literary trends of the time. National identity. The Hung Kings are perceived as the founders of the Viet civilization and are promoted by the government as a source of national pride and solidarity through platforms such as the state-sponsored commemoration of an annual holiday, the Hung Kings Temple Festival to honor the Hung Kings, and the promotion of the Hung King National Museum in VI letter 1 EC7T Tri-City. In the Museum of Vietnamese History in Ho Chi Minh City, the exhibits are arranged chronologically, with the first one on the rise of the Hung Kings. Revival of worship of Hung Kings. With the D-stroke letter 1 ED5IM letter 1 EDBI reforms from 1986, Vietnam saw a resurrection of traditional festivals, including the Hung Kings Temple Festival. Celebrations of the Hung Kings moved from the local to the provincial and then to the state levels. This revival has been perceived as an attempt by the government to maintain the Vietnamese identity of its people in view of increase in foreign influence. In 1999, the government issued a directive on the celebration on what it perceived as the most important events in 2000. Other than the Hung Kings Festival, the other events perceived to be important were the 70th anniversary of the Vietnamese Communist Party, the 110th anniversary of H letter 1 ED3 Chai Min's birthday, the 25th anniversary of the victory in the campaign against Americans to save the country, the 55th anniversary of the August Revolution, and the start of the 21st century. Hung Kings Temple Festival. The Hùng King's Temple Festival Vietnamese, Chi letter 1 ed 70 letter 1 ed 5 Hung Vuan or L letter 1 ec 5 H letter 1 ed 9 id stroke letter 1 ec 1 n Hung is a Vietnamese festival held annually from the 8th to the 11th days of the third lunar month in honour of the Hùng Kings. The main festival day, which has been designated a public holiday in Vietnam since 2007, is on the 10th day. Every year, leading government figures make pilgrimages to the Hùng King's Temple in Phu Th letter 1 ECD province to honour the Ku letter 1 ed 1 CT letter 1 ed 9 national founder. In April 2016, the festival at the Hùng King's Temple in Phu Th letter 1 ECD attracted about 7 million people. NGUY letter 1 EC5 N Phu Tho letter 1 ECDNG, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, also attended. In 2018, the state established Association for Liaison with Overseas Vietnamese implemented a project titled Vietnam Ancestral Global Day, which organised various cultural activities worldwide to celebrate Hùng King's Memorial Day. This year is the first time that Vietnam Ancestral Global Day has been celebrated simultaneously in many European countries following a shared format. Since 2015, one of the three main goals of the Vietnam Ancestral Global Day project has been to preserve and spread the Hùng King's worship right amongst overseas Vietnamese. UNESCO recognition. In 2012, the worship of the Hùng Kings in Phu Th letter 1 ECD was recognised by UNESCO as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity, and the UNESCO page notes that this tradition embodies spiritual solidarity and provides an occasion to acknowledge national origins and sources of Vietnamese cultural and moral identity.